whether America ever really was exceptional in the first place. You're questioning that. How come?
Well, there's two meanings of the word in this context. One is analytical, and the other is sort of, normative or ideational, right? In the ideational sense, any power, any superpower, any empire at the apex of its power is going to hold itself to be exceptional. And that's almost a law of history, right? Throughout history, whether it is ancient Rome or the Ottomans or the Mongols, view themselves as to be, supreme, divine, fill in the blank, European colonial powers, obviously, as well. But whether it only works if it's relational, bidirectional. It has to be accepted for it to be valid. Or it has to be analytically true in the sense that everyone is obeying that power. Now, none of those things are true at this point, right? Americans have a great deal of self-doubt as to whether or not they are still exceptional. Secondly, it certainly isn't recognized as true anymore by other powers in the system. And of course, on a relative basis, it's moving in the direction where others are also seeing themselves as increasingly exceptional. So if exceptional is held to be unique, singular, then there can only be one exceptional power in the system, if any, at any given time. And if it isn't recognized that America is that one power, then again, by definition, you wind up in the situation that we're actually in, which is one that is, again, a multipolar world, a competitive landscape, numerous powers that either think of themselves as exceptional or don't care whether or not there is one exceptional power. They simply want to assert their interests. They're certainly not recognizing America as that sole exceptional power anymore.
I guess one of the best examples of that going today is America's effort to get much of the world to follow it in terms of sanctioning Russia for its conduct, its appalling conduct in the war in Ukraine. And yet the attempts to isolate Russia have really fallen flat, with an exception of very few countries. Why do you think that is?
Correct. And again, it was a very severe misdiagnosis of the way in which particularly Asian countries relate to Russia. You can see the map behind me, perhaps. This is Asia, and there's a giant landmass or country at the top of this map, and it is Russia. Now, for a geographer and from a geographical perspective, Russia, the territory, which is indeed the other largest country in the world next to Canada, I should point out, is basically North Asia. But of course, we, as citizens of Western countries or Western analysts, tend to look at Russia through a diplomatic prism. We see it as a country, we categorize it as Eastern Europe. We think of it as culturally European or Eastern European, and we think of it as having once aspired to be part or join Western organizations, in FIFA or the World Bank or the United Nations. It's clustered as a European or Eastern European country. But in reality, of course, it is North Asia, right? That is literally what Russia, by and large, is geographically, North Asia. And so it was a misdiagnosis because, of course, Asian countries, whether it is democracies or non-democracies, whether it's China or India or others, have fairly intense economic ties with Russia. They depend on Russia and benefit from its cheap commodities prices and its proximity. And they did not want to see and do not want to see their import prices and therefore, their trade deficits or current account deficits spike as a result of sanctions on Russia. And so they have not played along at all. And part of that is certainly resulted in, or that has partially resulted in Russia being able to, continue in terms of its economic longevity, despite the pressures that Western sanctions have imposed. So again, you can't isolate Russia. You can't isolate any country in the world if you don't have a single Asian power on board with your sanctions regime. And that's basically what has happened.
Well, let me follow up on that, because if we were to change our orientation of how we think about Russia, not as sort of Moscow and West, but rather as North Asia, how should that change the way we relate to that country?
How we relate to Russia?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. It is increasingly an anchor of an Asian system. And this Asian system is increasingly economically interdependent. And of course, with Russia, its largest trade partners, investment partners now are literally all Asian. And that's likely to remain the case for a long time. So I would say one has to obviously continue to defend one's Western borders, because just because Russia is increasingly acting like and aligning with Asian powers doesn't mean it isn't still very relevant in the West. It's fighting a war right now with ourselves as Western powers and nations and states and NATO countries. So that doesn't change the fact that it needs to be, if you will, pushed back, repelled, and prevented from remaining belligerent, hostile, and annexing any more territory of Western or Western-leaning countries like Ukraine. So in that sense, the calculation doesn't change. But the diplomatic isolation or that aspect of the strategy is clearly not going to work.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.